The house felt different the moment Ethan Miller stepped inside. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty in a way that pressed against his chest. The lights were off, and the air carried a stillness that didn't belong to a normal evening. He called Laura's name once, then again, but his voice echoed back to him. That was when he noticed the small things. Her shoes were gone from the rack. The coat she always wore in winter was missing. In the kitchen, a single sheet of paper rested. On the counter, folded neatly as if she had taken her time before leaving. Ethan unfolded the note slowly. The words were simple, almost polite. She wrote that she needed space, that she couldn't continue living the way they were living. There was no anger in the message, no blame, and that somehow hurt more than shouting ever could. Ethan sat down. At the table, still wearing his jacket, reading the note again and again, hoping the meaning would change. It didn't. Laura had walked out of their marriage without drama, without noise, leaving only silence behind. For a long moment, Ethan did nothing. His mind searched for signs he might have missed. The late nights at work, the way Laura had started eating dinner earlier, often alone, the conversations that had slowly faded into short, careful sentences. He had told himself this was normal, that long marriages went through quiet phases. Now he wondered if the quiet had been a warning he ignored. He walked through the house, as if seeing it for the first time. The living room looked clean but lifeless. The couch where they once shared movies now felt like furniture in a waiting room. In the bedroom, one side of the closet was half empty, and Laura's scent was already fading. Ethan stood there, gripping the doorframe, feeling the weight of her absence settle in his bones. That night, he slept poorly. The bed felt too wide, the ceiling too high. Every sound startled him: the hum of the heater, a car passing outside. He kept expecting Laura to walk in to say this was a mistake, that she just needed a night away. Morning came without her. The days that followed blurred together. Ethan went to work, answered emails, and smiled when needed, but inside he felt disconnected from everything. He ate meals without taste and came home to a house that no longer felt like shelter. Friends noticed he was quieter, but he brushed off their concern. He didn't know how to explain a loss that hadn't come with an ending, only an absence. At night, his thoughts grew louder. He replayed old conversations, searching for the moment where things had gone wrong. He remembered Laura's eyes drifting away when he spoke, her patience growing thin, even during small disagreements. He remembered choosing work over talking, silence over effort. Regret crept in slowly, not as guilt, but as a dull understanding that love needed care he hadn't given. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows, Ethan sat alone in the living room, staring at a photo from years ago. In it, he and Laura were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, unaware of the distance that would one day grow between them. He wondered when that connection had faded. He wondered if it could have been saved. The doorbell rang suddenly, cutting through his thoughts. The sound startled him. Wasn't expecting anyone. For a brief second, hope flirted unreasonable. Fragile hope that it might be Laura. He opened the door slowly. Standing there was Margaret Collins, Laura's mother. She looked at him with concern, her face lined with worry, her posture calm, but unsure. Ethan hadn't seen her in months. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of Laura's absence stood between them. "I hope I'm not intruding," Margaret said softly. "I just wanted to check on you." Ethan stepped aside without thinking. As she entered, the house felt less empty, though the silence remained. He didn't know what this visit meant or what she would say. All he knew was that Laura had left, and now her mother stood in her place, carrying questions Ethan wasn't sure he was ready to face. And as the door closed behind her, Ethan sensed that this unexpected visit was not just about concern. It was the beginning of a conversation that would change everything he thought he knew about love, loss, and the quiet choices that shape a life. Margaret stood in the kitchen as if she had been there many times before. even though she hadn't. She placed her bag on the chair and looked around the room with careful eyes. The house felt heavy, and Ethan could sense that she felt it too. He offered her tea more out of habit than thought, and she accepted with a small nod. The kettle's sound filled the silence, giving them both a moment to breathe. They sat across from each other at the table. Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm cup, staring into it before finally speaking. She said Laura was safe and staying with a friend. She said her daughter needed time to understand herself. Ethan listened without interrupting, holding onto every word as if it were a fragile thread connecting him to his wife. Margaret spoke calmly, not with blame, but with concern. She told him Laura had felt lonely for a long time, even while sharing a home. She said her daughter struggled to express her needs and often expected others to sense them without being told. Ethan felt a quiet ache as he heard this. He realized how often he had mistaken silence for peace. He told Margaret he never meant to hurt Laura. He admitted he focused too much on work, believing stability was enough. He said he thought love could survive without constant attention. Margaret listened closely, her eyes kind but honest. She told him many marriages fail not from cruelty, but from neglect that grows unnoticed. Time passed quickly as they talked. The tea went cold. Margaret shared memories of Laura as a child, sensitive, thoughtful, easily overwhelmed by emotional distance. These stories painted a fuller picture of the woman Ethan had married. He began to see Laura not just as his wife, but as someone shaped by fears he never truly understood. As the afternoon light faded, Margaret stood to leave. At the door, she paused and turned back. She told Ethan he was not a bad man, just a quiet one. And sometimes quiet people forget to speak love out loud. Her words stayed with him long after she left. The next day, Ethan noticed the house felt different. Still empty, but not as suffocating. Margaret's visit had stirred something inside him, forcing him to face truths he had avoided. He found himself thinking about Laura in a new way, not with anger or confusion, but with empathy. A few days later, Margaret returned. This time, she didn't hesitate at the door. She brought groceries and insisted on cooking dinner. The normal act felt strange, yet comforting. They moved around the kitchen with ease, exchanging simple conversation about food, weather, and daily routines. It felt natural, almost peaceful. Over dinner, they spoke again about Laura. Margaret said her daughter was conflicted, torn between wanting freedom and fearing regret. Ethan admitted he didn't know whether to hope for reconciliation or prepare for an ending. The uncertainty weighed on him, but saying it aloud eased the burden. Margaret stayed longer that evening. They talked about life beyond marriage dreams, set aside choices made out of fear rather than desire. Ethan realized how much of himself he had lost while trying to be reliable and responsible. Margaret understood this more than he expected, sharing her own regrets about staying silent in past relationships. When she finally left, Ethan stood at the door longer than necessary, watching her walk to her car. He felt gratitude, but also confusion. Her presence had brought comfort he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't romantic, but it was deeply human. Days passed and her visits continued. Sometimes they spoke deeply. Other times they simply sat in silence, sharing the same space. Ethan found himself looking forward to those moments. He felt supported without being judged, heard without being fixed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the room, Margaret said something that stayed with him. She said relationships fail when people stop seeing each other clearly. She said love doesn't always end in anger. Sometimes it fades quietly, leaving people unsure of where they stand. After she left that night, Ethan sat alone, thinking about her words. He understood now that Laura's departure wasn't sudden. It was the final step in a long emotional journey. Margaret's visits had opened his eyes, but they also stirred feelings he wasn't ready to name. As he turned off the lights and prepared for another restless night, Ethan sensed that this chapter of his life was far from over. The answers he sought were closer than before, but so were new questions. And somewhere between loss and understanding, a deeper change was quietly taking shape.